Hey there. Welcome to the Health and Harmony podcast, where your health and harmony are our mission. I am Chrissy Rice, a spiritual wellness coach joined by Mike Fave, an independent researcher and health clinician. And today's episode, we are going to talk all about good fat and bad fats. So Let's get started and let's just talk about all the fats today, Mike.
All right, let's jump in. So there's 3 types of fatty acids. There are saturated fats, there are monounsaturated fats, and there are polyunsaturated fats. Now, the difference between these types of fats is their structure. The saturated fats don't have any of something called a double bond. The monounsaturated fats have one double bond, that's why they're called mono. And then the polyunsaturated fats have more than one double bond, which is why it's poly. Now, you don't really need to know all the chemistry directly. It's probably without seeing it, it's a little bit difficult to just describe. But essentially, the more double bonds the fat has, the more likely it is to be damaged by different things. Heat, any type of oxidative stress or any type of oxidation reactions. So essentially, saturated fats are the most stable fats there are. They're really hard to damage comparatively to the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Now, next up is monounsaturated fats. They're actually quite stable as well overall, and especially compared to the polyunsaturated fats. The polyunsaturated fats, now, they're defined by having more than 2 double bonds or 2 double bonds or more. So you can have them, things like fish oil that contains DHA or EPA, these magical fatty acids that everybody talks about in the health sphere. They can have, DHA, I think, is like 6 double bonds. So it's quite unstable. It's very easily damaged. So this is a general kind of understanding of these types of fats. The saturated, most stable, polyunsaturated, least stable, and the more of those double bonds you add to the structure. With polyunsaturated, the less stable they become, the more easily damaged they are, whereas monounsaturated, still quite stable, closer towards that saturated side. So you can see that these things kind of have a spectrum: saturated on one side, mono in the middle, and poly on the other side, from most stable to least stable. So that's how you can kind of think about these fats. Now, people are probably sitting here thinking like, okay, so you have these 3 types of fats, but what is an actual saturated fat? What's a source of saturated fat? What's a source of mono? What's a source of poly?
We read it on the nutritional label, but we're like, okay,
yeah.
Which one is what?
All fats contain a variety or a mix of all 3 of these types of fats. So cocoa butter, olive oil, avocados, soybean oil, they all have a mix of monounsaturated, saturated, and polyunsaturated fats. The biggest question is just proportion. How much of these different types of fats do they have? So the most saturated fats are things like coconut oil, palm kernel oil, and butter and ghee. Those are very saturated fats. They don't have that much monounsaturated fat, and they have very minimal polyunsaturated fat. In the middle, you have fats that are they're in between saturated and monounsaturated. They have a decent amount of monounsaturated fat, and then they have a decent amount of saturated fat, but still they don't have that much polyunsaturated fat. Those fats are things like cocoa butter, chocolate, beef fat, so beef tallow, lamb fat, so fatty red meats. So those are going to be your sources where you have a nice mix. Then you get to things that are mostly monounsaturated. So that's going to be things like olive oil, avocados, avocado oil, macadamia nuts, macadamia nut oil, and then palm oils. Probably palm oil you could probably put there. It does have a decent amount of saturated fat as well. So those are going to be kind of your monounsaturated to saturated fat groups. And then egg yolks. So now you have, by fat percentage, fats that have a little bit more polyunsaturated. And those are things like egg yolks have a little bit more polyunsaturated fats. And we'll break down the difference between omega-3 and omega-6 in just a second. So you have things like egg yolks, which will fall between the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated, depending on what the chickens are fed. And then all the way on the polyunsaturated side, you have things like nuts and seeds, and then the vegetable or the seed oils. So those are things like soybean oil, canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, sesame oil, corn oil. Those are going to be your major sources of the polyunsaturated fats. And then for nuts and seeds, you have things like sunflower seeds, you have walnuts, you have almonds, you have basically any other nut or seed, with the exception of macadamia nuts. Any other common nut or seed. There's some other random ones that are actually more saturated. But most, like mango seed, like most people don't eat mango seed or things like that. So that's something to think about. The major ones that we usually have available to us that I just mentioned, as far as nuts and seeds, are, with the exception of macadamia, are pretty unsaturated, polyunsaturated overall. I don't know if you want to have any questions about any of those before I break anything down further.
I kind of do. So as far as, I know you said all of these things have each category in them.
Yes.
Which categories are more health beneficial to people versus not really health beneficial? Because I know what category I don't actually eat or I try to stay away from because it's highly inflammatory.
Yes. So the polyunsaturated fats, because they are so much less stable, tend to be more problematic overall for the body, whereas the saturated and monounsaturated fats are a lot better overall from a health perspective. Now, too much saturated fat can cause some issues for some people because it's like processing all of that saturated fat at the liver can be a bit problematic. But overall, if you're leaning towards monounsaturated and saturated fat, I think most people would do better with those. And it's kind of figuring out where do you do the best with? Are you more monounsaturated? Are you more saturated? Do you do well with kind of a mix? The good thing is most of those fats, are really tasty. It's like butter and chocolate and beef fat and macadamia nuts and olive oil and avocados and coconut oil and coconut products and things like that are great. On the flip side, the polyunsaturated fats are pretty unhealthy overall, especially the omega-6 variety. So with polyunsaturated fats, so basically we have the healthy fats, right, that we talked about, the monounsaturated and the saturated fats. They are very stable. They're not easily damaged. So when you eat them and you take them into your body, they are incorporated into the structure of your body, and you're basically building your body out of steel instead of building your body out of some flimsy wood or paper or something like that. That's kind of the way to think about it. So when you're constructing your body out of a certain type of fat, you want it to be more monounsaturated and more saturated overall, and you don't want to have a high amount of polyunsaturated fats making your structures, because if there's any damage, if you're under oxidative stress, like all what they talk about, or just having a higher, a lot of us, our body temperatures are around 98.6 degrees. Some of those fats actually start to get damaged at those temperatures. Right. So the polyunsaturated fats specifically, not the monounsaturated and the saturated. So you want to be moving more towards these other types of fats. Now, polyunsaturated fats, there's two types. There's omega-6 and there's omega-3. The difference between them is where their double bonds are. So where the double bonds are in the fats, and then also within them, there's a number of double bonds. So as an example, linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, has, I think, 2 double bonds in it. And then there's arachidonic acid, I think, has 6. It's either 4 or 6. And then you have linolenic acid, has 2 double bonds. And then the arachidonic acid, or the DHA, has 6 double bonds. So the more double bonds you have in these fats, the more likely they are to be damaged overall. So ideally, with them, if you have something that has like 6 double bonds, like a DHA or an arachidonic acid, it's much more likely to be damaged under oxidative stress or under or with the higher body temperatures or things along those lines. So you don't want to have a high amount of these. And arachidonic acid has 4 double bonds. I looked it up here. I'm pretty sure DHA has 6. And then linoleic acid, that has 2. And I'm pretty sure linolenic acid also has 2. So let me just pull that up so I can make sure telling you guys the right things. So linolenic acid has 3. So There we go. Okay. So linoleic acid has 3 double bonds. Linoleic acid has 2 double bonds. The arachidonic acid has 4 double bonds, and the DHA has 6 double bonds. So the way you can see it is linoleic acid is the least likely to be damaged overall. Then you have linoleic acid, then you have arachidonic acid, and then you have DHA, which is like one of the fats that's most likely to be damaged. Now, so besides being damaged, or go ahead, Chrissy, I don't know if you want to.
No, keep going. Yeah, no, okay.
Besides being damaged by oxidative reactions in the body, or like even digestion or body temperature or anything like that, these fats are the precursors for inflammatory molecules in the body. These inflammatory molecules are called eicosanoids. And so the anti-inflammatories that people take, your aspirin, your ibuprofen, your naproxen, those drugs actually block the conversion of these fats, these polyunsaturated fats, into the inflammatory mediators. So not only if you eat very large amounts of polyunsaturated fats, are you building your body's structure out of these very easily damaged components, you also are loading yourself up on precursors to the inflammatory mediators. So basically it's like you have a whole bunch of dynamite stored in the shed, and you want to make sure that you don't get any fire by it, because if there's no fire, okay, you'll be all right. But if you light the fuse, you might have a serious problem going on. So minimizing the polyunsaturated fats is helpful from both those perspectives. Any questions about that before I jump into the omega-3 and omega-6 a little bit more?
No, but
okay.
Very informative.
Yes.
Because I didn't know that part about it, but I like your dynamite explanation.
So you have they're crappy building products, and they're highly explosive. That's right. The two things to take away from the polyunsaturated fats.
Right.
The next thing is, now the omega-3s you tend to get from fish oil and fish products. The omega-6s you tend to get from seed oil, soybean oil, canola oil, safflower oil, and the nuts and things like this. So the walnuts and the almonds and the flax seeds and all this type of stuff. Although they also have some omega-3s, the walnuts and the flax seeds, but it's not the same omega-3s as fish oil.
Right.
The fish oil has DHA and EPA, and in the flax and walnut have the alpha-linolenic acid, which has the 3 double bonds, and the DHA and EPA. The DHA has 6, and the EPA, we can look really quick, make sure I tell everybody the right thing. So EPA, double bonds. EPA also has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So EPA has 5 double bonds, and then DHA has the 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. So yeah, so the omega-6 fats in general are turned into are more turned in towards the inflammatory eicosanoid mediators.
Right.
So the ones that are signaling tons and tons of inflammation. The omega-3s are generally turned into what people call the anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. Now, they also can produce some pro-inflammatory eicosanoids, well, these inflammatory signaling molecules, but the anti-inflammatory molecules that they produce tend to be a bit immunosuppressive. So there's some interesting studies where they load rats up on fish oil and expose them to an infection that causes colitis, so an irritation of their colons, or they load them up on not fish oil, but something like soybean oil or something along those lines. Or they give the rats like a diet that's low in both omega-3 and omega-6. Now, the rats that get a ton of fish oil, they didn't get colitis, but they got sepsis. So the bacteria were able to get to their bloodstream, and then they had systemic infections, and they actually had a high mortality rate. Right. The rats that got the omega-6s, with the pro-inflammatory mediators, they didn't get sepsis, and they lived, but they had bad colitis. Right. So the omega-3s, no colitis, not a strong inflammatory response, but they died because they got systemic infections. The omega-6, strong inflammatory response, their colons were really irritated, but they didn't get systemic infections that killed them.
So they
didn't get as much systemic infections that killed them.
Yeah, I was going to say, neither one of these sounds good.
Well, the rats that got fed the low omega-3 and omega-6 fats, the control diet, they actually didn't get severe colitis, and they also didn't die of systemic infections.
Oh, okay.
So the takeaway is you don't want to have a massive amount of fish oil, and you don't
Right.
want to have a massive amount of the omega-6s, the corn oil, the soybean oil, the safflower oil, this type of stuff. You want to keep the polyunsaturated fats in general on the lower side in the diet, and you want to prioritize the saturated and monounsaturated fats. Again, you don't want to load your tissues up with dynamite, and you don't want to make your body's structure out of bad building materials. You want to use that, that high quality hard wood. You don't want to be using that. Here in the Philippines, they use this like coconut palm wood, and it's like this soft wood, and it's not really that strong. So it's like a garbage wood compared to like a really high quality pine or whatever the other thing is. So that's kind of how you can see that this kind of breakdown. So those are the biggest pieces. And again, the polyunsaturated very likely to get damaged, whereas monounsaturated and saturated not so likely to get damaged overall.
Yeah, and let's just say how many things the polyunsaturated fats are in, because if you look at your pantry right now and you go and look at those boxes of things that you have in there, guaranteed there's canola oil, there's vegetable oil, there's all sorts of bad oils in there.
Yeah,
because it's cheaper to use those to make products that sit on the shelves longer than it is, so really, I mean, when you are at the grocery store or you're trying to find stuff that doesn't have those polyunsaturated fats, you have to be a label reader. It's in everything.
Yeah. So with the polyunsaturated fats, particularly the omega-6s are in everything. The fish stuff, like the only place you get the omega-3s really, the EPA, DHA, and whatnot, most people are either supplementing fish oil or they're eating seafood. And we'll talk about the differences because that's actually a good conversation to have. Yeah. As far as omega-6s, it's pretty much understood across the board by all of the alternative health communities in general that you don't want to load up on omega-6. It's really only the mainstream medicine that has said, oh, you want to have a high amount of omega-6. Now, the reason, so omega-6 was not high in the human diet, at least in the U.S. diet, until around the 1940s and 50s, when there was a shift from the production of cotton for clothing and whatnot. I think they created polyester, and so then the cotton plantations stopped producing cotton for clothing. They started making more polyester-based clothing, and so now you have all this land that you need to do something with. So then they started shifting towards the ideas around the polyunsaturated fatty acids being ideal, because you could take cotton seeds and soybeans and these different crops that grow in the United States and press them for oils. Yeah. And then you could sell the population these cooking oils. And then there was this entire campaign around, I think it's a 7-country studies. There's an Ansel Keys thing where it's like, oh, polyunsaturated fats lower cholesterol, and cholesterol causes heart disease. Now, there's a lot of controversy around that work. It wasn't really great work overall, but the hypothesis stuck, and the industry was supported by this type of stuff. So in the early 1900s, there's some papers showing the intake of omega-6 fats was actually quite low. It's a very low percentage of the diet. The increase in some of these types of fats increased like almost 1,000% from the early 1900s until today. And it's even increased, I think, even more so. So the intake of those things in the diet have drastically increased, and they tend to mirror the metabolic problems that people are seeing with obesity, with diabetes, with inflammatory disorders, etc. So it's not causation yet, but there's a very strong correlation, actually better than correlation with added sugars in the diet, with these particular fats. So these types of fats are highly problematic, and the reason I think they're added into the food supply is because the U.S. is a great producer of soybeans and corn and cottonseed and safflower and sunflower and things like that. So there's a lot of industry to produce this oil. So then that's what gets pushed inside research and the marketing and whatnot. And with the cardiovascular stuff, what they show is that the polyunsaturated fats lower cholesterol. And then there's the whole cholesterol hypothesis that cholesterol is what's causing heart disease. So if you just lower it, you'll have less heart disease. So since these oils lower it, then you should technically have less heart disease. Well, that's not actually the full picture. It's not just the cholesterol, and this is an entirely different story. We could talk about this on an episode, but the cholesterol itself isn't directly causing heart disease. It's oxidized cholesterol that is primarily involved in the areas of atherosclerosis, and then damage to the vasculature can induce that heart disease, that atherosclerosis. So it's what are those initiating factors? Where's the oxidized cholesterol coming from? What's triggering that process and whatnot? And that's a whole story. And then how are polyunsaturated fats lowering cholesterol? Well, they're doing it through some mechanisms that's, maybe not ideal overall. So there's questions around that. So the omega-6s in general, not really good. There's not really much controversy in most of the health spheres, not the mainstream, cardiologists in general, but the alternative types of spheres around omega-6 and seed oils being problematic. With fish oil, this is where things get a little bit hairy, or scaly or slimy or however you.
So many people love fish oil.
Well, the thing is, fish oil has been promoted as this like potent anti-inflammatory. Yeah. And while it is anti-inflammatory in the short term, it is because some of the mediators that it produces are anti-inflammatory. They call them the pro-resolving mediators. So you have the resolvins as one class. There's a variety of classes. And what happens with these is they have a somewhat antagonistic effect on some of the omega-6 based polyunsaturated fat mediators. The other thing is the omega-3s compete with omega-6 fats for the enzymes that make these mediators. And in the omega-3s, they induce an antioxidant response in the body because they are so easily damaged. When they are around in the products, their damaged products get released, the body mounts this defensive response, because if not, it will destroy the cells, it'll destroy the tissues. So there's that component going on. It's just long-term running that over time is not good. In the short term, sure, it helps, but there's also other anti-inflammatories you use. And the way that it's helping is not in the best way. And then in the long term, it's like you're loading up your tissues on these really unsaturated fats that have that are very likely to be damaged, and then the damaging products are not overall. So that's really the biggest problem. Now, what I'd say is I don't recommend personally anybody to use fish oil. I don't think it's a good thing, especially because most fish oil on the shelves is already rancid. The stuff is so likely to be damaged that even at room temperature on the shelf, you are getting a damaged product. What I recommend people do, and this isn't to get omega-3s, but I recommend people eat seafood, because the seafood is high-quality protein, high-quality vitamins and minerals. It helps you to get some variety in your diet. So there's a lot of benefits to the seafood. There's some anti-inflammatory peptides inside the seafood as well. So high-quality seafood, great. And with that, you will be getting some omega-3s by default. Now, it's not that you're prioritizing to get massive amount of omega-3s, but you're going to get enough, because the other thing is the omega-3 and the omega-6 fats have been called the essential fatty acids because our body doesn't produce them. The thing is that the actual requirements for these fats inside the body to prevent deficiency is so low that on a normal diet, on a normal healthy diet, a whole foods diet, it's almost impossible to become deficient. The way that they induce deficiency in people has been they are on parenteral feedings or enteral feedings. So they're in the hospital and they're getting fed through an IV in their vein, a specially formulated mixture, and they happen to have not enough of these fats in their mixture, or too much omega-6 relative to omega-3, and the person wasn't getting any intake in from the rest of their diet. So that was more an error in the formulation of some of these components that are these feeds that people were getting that induced the deficiency, and not because they were eating a normal diet, or in rat studies where they actually try to induce it by using a lab-based diet. So in those circumstances, you can do it. But in a normal diet, it's very unlikely you're going to see deficiency. Now, the problem is that the omega-3s and omega-6, as I said, compete for these different enzymes and components. And very high omega-6 intakes can cause an imbalance with omega-3 intakes. And the American diet, the standard American diet, has a massive amount of omega-6 in it, a ridiculous amount of omega-6, because as you said, it's in all of the food products. It's in every packaged food. All the restaurants are cooking with it. You can't, unless you are adamant about not having it, or you're mostly preparing your own food, it's difficult to avoid, because everywhere is using these different products, or these different oils, the canola oil, soybean oil, sesame oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, whatever it is, because they're cheap, they're easy to come by in the U.S. because they produce a crap ton of it,
Yep.
And then there's this idea, it's heart healthy, which is a questionable idea overall. So that's where you're seeing the problem. But again, I'll stop here and then we'll go on to the basics because you have some questions.
I was going to say, so it says that it's going to help with cholesterol, but it's going to increase inflammation.
Yeah, so it's I think in the long run it causes some metabolic dysfunction. It does. Yeah. If you have a oxidative or inflammatory stimulus, it perpetuates it to some extent. And then overall, like, because it's so easily damaged, it's just it's not a good source of fats to incorporate in the diet when you can use something like monounsaturated or saturated fats. And there's some studies looking at how much saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats are in the actual membranes of the cells of different organisms like rats and humans and birds. And basically, the less polyunsaturated fat inside the cell membrane, the longer the animal lives. And that's that's even amongst species. So you take a human, and one human has more monounsaturated and saturated fats inside their membranes than another human. In general, they would tend to live longer, which is a very interesting thing to see.
It is. I mean, before I started my health journey, you can go into my pantry and find all the polyunsaturated fats you wanted. They were all in there.
Yep.
And now, I mean, you could fill your pantry and have like a plethora of things that you wanted to add there because you were free to buy whatever you wanted when you weren't watching that. But now in my pantry, I have like a stock of like 6 items. Like there's 6 snacks that we eat, and I keep it pretty basic because anything else has to come from fresh ingredients.
Yes.
But if you're walking down those aisles in the store, they're everywhere. They're in salad dressings, they're in cereals, they're in chips, they're in cookies, they're in every single thing in the store. We don't have a dedicated aisle to the good fat.
Yeah.
Yet.
So that's the next company, right? We're gonna make our low PUFA snack company. Just call it low PUFA.
Yeah.
PUFA for everyone is everybody. Yeah. PUFA is polyunsaturated fatty acids. It's the abbreviation that they put in the research. But yeah, that's low PUFA coming to you soon.
Yes. Our new product line.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to live in the US and be able to make good fat choices for yourself and for your family's health. It's very hard. So, I mean, I switched to only cooking with avocado oil, olive oil, grass-fed butter, and on occasion macadamia oil, but that's pretty much what I cook with now. And I used to have big, huge containers of canola oil to bake with because I'm a baker. So huge, giant Costco-sized oils. And now I've switched everything from canola oil to avocado oil because it doesn't have that strong flavor, just like canola. So my baked goods are now healthier for you.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing is, around the world, the U.S. culture is like being picked up by a lot of countries, and they're starting to incorporate a lot of seed oils in their food. So in South America, here in Asia, people are starting to use canola oil, and it's being marketed as heart healthy and this and that. And then the other thing is you're starting to see diseases rise. Again, this is a correlation, not necessarily causation, but you're starting to see chronic diseases rise pretty significantly. Heart disease, diabetes, cancers, things like that, where they may not have been to the levels that they were before, because the main oils here in places like South America previously, here is coconut oil in the Philippines, and then in other countries, there's also palm oil here, and then there was lard. And then in other countries, it was lard or coconut oil or something along those lines. In Africa, it was palm oil, coconut oil, maybe lard or some type of animal fat, beef tallow, some depending on where you were, or dairy fats. And now everything is being switched towards these polyunsaturated fats, the soybean oil, the canola oil, the corn oil, and you're starting to see obesity increase. You're starting to see diabetes increase. Again, this is not saying it's direct causation, but it seems that what we do know is everywhere in the world that people adopt a Western diet, and this is documented multiple places, they get chronic diseases. They get diabetes, they get heart disease. they get cancers, they get things that did not exist before.
Yeah.
And so,
and they're very sneaky. The oils, I think, are the sneakiest things. I think when people start to pay attention to, you know, how much protein they're eating, how much how many carbs that they're eating, those are not so sneaky. But the oils they really do sneak themselves into your diet. You don't even know that they're there. You think that you're feeding your family all this healthy food, and then you're like, whoa, these are loaded with just chemicals and not good stuff for your body.
Yeah.
You know?
The oils are, and even in restaurants, they're cooking in those oils. The sauces are loaded with those oils, salad dressings, as you said, any baked products, most packaged foods, they're in all of this stuff. And that's where you start to see, I think, the serious, that's where they're hidden. You're not really knowing that you're ingesting this large amount of oils. And that's why when I work with people, I have them start to track in Chronometer and see what they're doing, because you put the diet in there, you start to see the packaged food, you start to see the polyunsaturated fat intake, mostly omega-6, and the amounts are massive for people, 20, 30, 40 grams per day of these omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And ideally, you're trying to keep it to like 2% of the diet or less. So that's definitely not even close. It's quite a bit. So yeah, the solution is not to, so some people posit the solution that we have all this omega-6, so we need to balance it out by having more omega-3s. So just take fish oil, take larger omega-3s. Larger amounts of omega-3s. I actually don't think that that's the best solution. I think the best solution overall is to lower the omega-6s in your diet as much as possible. Get rid of all the seed oils, soybean oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, all of these types of things. Minimize the processed and packaged foods that are cooked in these things or produced with these things. Move your fats over to olive oil, to butter, to coconut oil, to beef tallow, to chocolate, to avocados, things like this, to having some egg yolks in your diet, to beef fat. Move towards these, like fatty steaks or things like that. Move towards those types of fats. And then incorporate some seafood in your diet on a regular basis. And then there's what they talk about in the research, this idea of omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So you want to have like at least 3-to-1 omega-6. So 3-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. So 3 times as much omega-6 that you have to omega-3. Because like in the research, if you have too high amounts of omega-3s, there's some problems with that. Even when they dose omega-3s as a drug, as a pharmacological option, the dosage is like 2 grams or 3 grams a day. So you really don't need a massive amount to even have pharmacologic effects. Even if you have a small amount, so let alone prevent a deficiency. So you don't really want to have massive amounts of omega-3s, but you also don't want to have massive amounts of omega-6. You want to keep them both on the lower end. The ratio ideally 3-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3, and drastically lower omega-6, because most people are easily eating you have to really try in the beginning to lower that omega-6 intake, and that both of them I think you want to keep on the low side and switch to the monounsaturated and the saturated fats.
Yeah, and magic happens when you do.
Yeah.
Like if you just work on the fat part right now, like just look in your pantry and like look what you're going to eat just for today, and just switch out the canola oil for the olive oil or the avocado oil, magic happens. I'm telling you.
Yeah, it's definitely, a lot of people find when they switch these other fats and they dial in the diet altogether that weight loss is pretty easy. They start, some of the chronic inflammatory stuff they're dealing with improves pretty significantly. And then inside a lot of the animal research, lowering omega-6s and keeping the animals, not overloaded on these polyunsaturated fats actually has some health benefits. They're more resistant to infections and different components as well. So overall, I think that for me, that's the strategy that I employ for myself, and that's a strategy that I use with people that I work with. I drastically lower omega-6, and if people like seafood, I try to incorporate seafood in their diet, grass-fed dairy products, grass-fed meats, things along those lines, pastured, raised chicken, pork. Now, so this is the one caveat. Pork and chicken, if they are fed the normal diet that's traditional, that you traditionally give them in the U.S., it's corn and soy. Their fats will mirror the fatty acid profile of corn and soy because they are what they eat. Whereas cows, even if you feed them grains or corn and soy, because of how their digestive tract is set up with all the bacteria breaking things down, the cows actually have much less omega-6 and polyunsaturated fats because the bacteria are breaking down those fats in their digestive tract and turning them into trans fats and monounsaturated and saturated fats. So even if you have grain-fed red meats, they tend to be much lower in omega-6 and omega-3 than if you were to have pork or chicken that was fed high amounts of corn and soy. So if you're going to go towards pork or chicken, I'd recommend going towards the very lean cuts of those animals, or getting like a properly raised pigs, or that are pasture raised and their diet is good, or the chickens are pasture raised and things like that, because their fatty acid content of their tissues, the fat profile of their meats will be a lot better. But ideally just go for leaner cuts. So that's chicken breast, that's lean cuts of pork, not really eating too much pork fat overall. Would be the way to go. And then for omega-3s, I would say, most shellfish are game, mussels, clams, oysters. Then you have things, the crustaceans. So you have lobster, you have you have shrimp, back for the shellfish, you have the scallops as well. And then for fish, I would do maybe things like cod or sole or flounder, and not have a massive amount of salmon. Once in a while is fine. Once in a while for sardines is fine. They tend to be lower mercury fish as well. They have decent nutrient profiles, but I wouldn't try. A lot of people are eating, especially some people I work with coming from like some of these health spheres, are eating tons and tons of fatty fish, like very large amounts of salmon and sardines on a regular basis. And I think that there's a problem getting possibly too much omega-3s from some of these foods. So once in a while, no problem, but I would stick towards the leaner fish overall and the leaner seafood options overall, so that you're not getting a massive amount of omega-3s and trying to load up on like many grams of omega-3s every day from salmon and sardines and things like that.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
That was a lot of information about good fats and bad fats. Love it.
Hopefully it was clear for everybody, and they have a sense of what to shoot for now.
I mean, they're everywhere. It's not just, butter versus canola oil. It's everything that we eat, and it's in everything that we consume. So it's really awesome to know about them and to understand them and to understand how they affect the body at the same time. Yep,
of course.
All right. So do you want to summarize for us, or did we just summarize?
Yeah, so so you want to minimize the omega-6 fats as much as possible. Sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, sesame oil, corn oil, whether that's in your packaged food, your sausage, your salads, dressings, don't cook with those things. Completely cut them out as much as possible. Shift more towards butter, beef tallow, cocoa butter, chocolate, avocado oil, olive oil, macadamia nuts, macadamia nut oil, coconut oil, maybe palm oil, things as like this. And then you want to incorporate some seafood in your diet, but you don't want too much fatty fish. So don't have salmon all the time and sardines all the time. Have some cod, have some sole, have some flounder, have some shrimp, have some scallops, have some of the shellfish, have some oysters, some mussels, some clams, things along these lines. And then I wouldn't supplement with any types of fish oil or anything like that. And so that would be the general setup overall. You're really shifting to these other fats, having some seafood in your diet, not getting really high amounts of omega-3s from tons of salmon and sardines and things from this perspective. And that's what I would do with the fats overall. And, try to get, maybe 3-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in your diet. You can use an app like Chronometer to track and see something like that if you're interested, and then try to keep them both, on the lower end, and especially omega-6 as low as possible.
Yeah, I like it. Yes. Yeah. And check your pantry today for all of the polyunsaturated fats that you have inside of there. Just kind of take notice of what you are consuming. And then when you're at the grocery store the next time, look for things that don't have those oils in them and just see what are your other options out there, because they do make products. They're out there. They make chips, they make crackers, they make cookies, they make all that stuff without those in there. So try to look for those things.
Yep.
And where can the people find you, Mike?
They can find me here on Health and Harmony, and they can also find me on MikeFave.com. And what about you?
Awesome. And same. You could find me right here on Health and Harmony, and you can find me at ChrissyRice.com. Awesome. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.